Okay, well, just a quick review before we really get into the text tonight of the book of Job. The outline is three sections. The first section is looking at Job's affliction, what actually happens to him. The second section is the largest by far of the book. It spans the vast majority of the book, all the way through chapter 37, which is the arguments that Job's three friends are going to bring up with him. And there will be a fourth guy that gets introduced later, but we won't even worry about him as far as outline is concerned. And with those three friends, you have Eliphaz, who is a fairly nice guy about his approach. He's going to get tougher as it goes, but he starts out pretty nice with his approach. Then Bildad, this guy's a little bit tougher. He's going to be a little bit meaner. If we go real quick tonight, you'll see his first argument and you'll see what I mean. And then the last guy is going to be Zophar, and this guy, he's just downright mean. By the time you get to him and his arguments with Job about what Job's problem is, because that's what all three of them are going to do. They're going to spend their time telling Job, this is why you're suffering, you need to get your act in order. And it all comes down to, in one way or another, each of them says, Job, you've done something wrong. Job, you've sinned, and that's why you're hurting. And so this will span the majority of the book. Well, the problem with that is, as a teacher, we run into this issue of how quick and how slow to go through this. And I can guarantee only one thing, which is I will not pick the right pace. I will pick it either too slow or I will pick it too fast. You'll either go through and go, man, he just missed a whole bunch of things, or you'll sleep through half the class and you'll thank me for the nap. So I'm going to try and find the balance, but it is a balance as we go through this. And then the last section is dealing with God's answers to Job, where God really lays down, Job, this is it. This is the answer to suffering. This is the answer to life's problems. This is what you need to understand in order to live through trials and suffering in this life. And so that's the outline of the book. And as I said, we'll go through it. We've got a lot of chapters to go through. And as we go through, it'll be obviously more than one chapter a week or something like that, because we'd be here forever. So let's get right into it. Let's look at Job's old life to start with. So if you go and you turn to Job chapter 1, you're going to see that he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 500 female donkeys, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and many servants. It says he had a great household. And then it finishes it off by saying he was the greatest of all the people in the East. So those numbers really don't mean a whole lot to us, other than you go, well, that's a lot. But when you put it in context of when he lived and who he was living amongst, he was the wealthiest, the greatest man. He was the top dog. Nobody had more than Job. And so the very first thing that we see is that he's going to lose it all. There's a conversation that God has with Satan. And Satan's going to go to God, and he's going to make a point about Job. Now, if you look there in Job chapter 1, let's look down here in about verse 7. It says, Lord said to Satan, from where do you come? And Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? So God points out with pride, here, have you looked at my servant Job? You've been traveling all over the earth. Have you looked at Job? That is a good man. There is a man I am proud of. Now, that for me puts shivers down my spine to think that that's the way God looks at His servants. That when we serve Him, He looks at it and says, look at that one. He doing my will. He makes me proud, just like a father does with his son. And so he says that to Satan, and Satan then makes the point. He says, does Job fear God for nothing? You made a hedge around him and around his household and around all that he has on every side. You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. So Satan's point is, yeah, Job loves you, but he loves you because the more he serves you, the more stuff he gets. So you just turn it on its end for a second, you take his protection away, you take all his wealth and riches away, and he will curse you. He'll just absolutely throw you away. Well, look at what it says in Job 1:21. When the servants came and one after the other said, well, first guy comes, he says, you've lost all of these things. Other says, you've lost all of these animals. Last one says, you've lost all of your children. They've all died. Well, Job, at the very end there, after seeing all that, it says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. So the first argument is, you take all his stuff away, Job won't love you anymore. Well, that one's answered within the first chapter. Was Satan right or wrong? He's wrong. You took all the stuff away, and Job said, yes, I'm hurting. Yes, I've lost it all, but God gave it to me in the first place, and it says Job didn't sin. So, next chapter, chapter 2, you're going to have that same conversation between God and Satan. God's going to say, look at my servant Job. And he's going to say to him, look at how he's serving me, even though you've incited me against him without cause. Even though he lost all these things and he didn't do anything wrong. And Satan's going to make the point. He's going to say, if you make it worse, if you'll take away his health, then he will change. As long as he has his health, he'll serve you. And so Satan makes the point, he says, skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath, will he give for his life. There is nothing more precious to a man than his life. And if you will take his quality of health away, then he'll no longer serve you. Yes, sir.
You skipped something.
Of course I did. I skipped lots of stuff.
What does it mean in verse 6, chapter 1?
There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Okay, what that means is when God's people were going before God. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus himself even says, we are all sons of God. And in the New Testament, we certainly would use that term, right? We're children of God. Well, that's not a New Testament only term. It would match the Old Testament too. So my understanding of verse 6 is, there was a time, probably at the temple. We don't know exactly the dating of Job. The most likely time seems to be during the time of the judges, but nobody knows that for sure. But at some time when all the faithful people came to gather together to go before God. One example of that would be, you take the Passover or something like that, right? All the faithful have gathered together at the tabernacle. That's what it's talking about. When all the faithful have come together, Satan was there amongst them, and it kind of adds to the picture a little bit too, because here's God, all the faithful have come to see him and to worship him, and Satan comes with them, and God says, here's all my servants, and have you looked at that one in particular? That Job? Job's something special, isn't he? And then they had the conversation. So does that answer it for you?
I was thinking it was the people that had died prior.
No, I think here you're looking at the term sons of God is used generically like children of God. So I think the most likely, it's a vague verse. Let me tell you that much. It's a vague verse, and people debate it a lot. But I think the easiest answer is probably going to just be children of God in some way, shape, or form, whether they were meeting at the temple or something like that. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, sir.
When Satan reappears in chapter 2, verse 2, though, he appears before the Lord, and he said, I just came from the earth.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of implies he wasn't currently on the earth.
You mean in chapter 2, it's like, okay, now Satan's up in heaven talking to God? Is that what you're... I'm not sure I understand.
It's the same audience as before. The sons of God came before the Lord again. If he was already on the earth, it's like, where have you been, Scott? Well, I've been on the earth. Well, of course, because we're on the earth right now.
Well,
There's the implication that he came from the earth.
See, I would take it more as it says, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Okay, so here it is. Sons of God, they're going, let's just say it's the temple, just for argument's sake. It could be anywhere on the earth, but just say the temple. So they go to present themselves before the Lord. Now that doesn't tell you where the Lord is. It just says they went to present themselves before the Lord. And then it says Satan was amongst them, and so he asked Satan, where did you come? And he says, I came from going to and fro on the earth. It's not necessarily, he's not just saying, I came from the earth. He's saying, I've been all about the earth. Where you been, Satan? Haven't seen you in a while. I've been all over the place on the earth, would be the way I'd take it. So it's not talking about, I'm in heaven now, but I was on the earth. It's, I'm before you now and I've been traveling. That'd be the way I take it. But like I said, it's a very vague verse. I wouldn't plant my salvation on it one way or the other. So it'll be one of those, and when we get to heaven, we'll go, God, why didn't you make that a little clearer? It just didn't make a lot of sense to me. So, so here it is, chapter 2. He says, you can take away his health, you can afflict him greatly, but you cannot kill him. That's the only thing you can't do. So you can hurt him in every way possible, but you can't kill him. That is really embarrassing. That's my cell phone. Somebody from New York was calling me of all things. That's the worst part of it. Everybody else I know's here. Okay, so in chapter 2, that part's laid down. So now we have Job, and his life really gets very bad. If you look down in verse 7, it says, Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd. That's just a little scrap of clay. And he took it, a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. So here it is. He's lost everything. Everything's gone. And here he is. He's sitting amongst the ashes and boils all over him. And all he can do is just sit there. And the only comfort he's got is that piece of clay to scrape those boils off. Now, I can read that 10,000 times and not understand it. You know what I'm saying? That kind of pain is beyond words. The emotional and mental anguish he's going through, having lost his children, his life, everything, and then the physical pain he's in. And it says in verse 9, his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. And now it gets so bad that his wife just says, just give up on God. Curse God and die and be done with it. Are you still wanting to fight? You're going to still say you're a righteous man? So even his own wife is telling him, give up. Job, just give up. And so he's totally alone. And it says, he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So even in this, even when everybody turned against him, Job said, no, I will accept the good and the bad from God. He's given me many good things, and now I've got my bad things, and I'll accept it. And so that's where we begin to look at Job at that point, when there's nothing more for him to lose. It cannot get any worse. Most of the time when we say it can't get worse, you go, don't you worry, it can. Well, here it can't. This is as bad as it could possibly get, and then we're introduced to his three friends. Anybody have any questions? Okay, so we're going to be introduced to his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and they came from their places, from their own places. They traveled wherever distance is to come and see him, and they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. So that's why they came. They came to bring comfort to Job. And it says, and when they raised their eyes from afar and did not recognize him, they lifted their voices and wept, and each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. Every time I think of this verse, I think of there was a young lady I went to high school with. And she was in a car accident, and they were driving on the beach, and the car rolled and rolled and rolled and rolled, and she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And so she just like in a big washer. And several people died in that car accident. She didn't. But they took her to the hospital, and they put a picture of her above the bed because that's the only way visitors would know it was her. She was that bad. That's what I think of. This man was so physically changed by the suffering he'd been through, the sicknesses he'd been through, that when his friends came to him, they didn't even recognize him. He didn't even look like Job. And so this man has been through everything you can think of and beyond. And then it says in verse 13, they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. There wasn't a word to be said. There wasn't anything they could say. They just sat there. But it does tell you they were really his friends, because only a friend would do that. You think about how much you would have to care about somebody in order to sit there and mourn with them without a word, because there's not a word to be said, for 7 days, 7 nights. And so these men sat there with Job, and they do care about him. They are his friends. But they sit there, and the grief is so great, the burden is so heavy, there's not anything anybody could say, because really, think about this, nobody before or since has suffered like this man. If you saw Job today, what would you tell him? Wouldn't be a word you could say either. And so they sat there with him, and then after that time came up, they're now going to begin to talk, and it's going to start with Job. Now, chapter 3 is going to be Job cursing the day of his birth. The whole chapter is going to be wrapped up in that. And so we'll look at just a couple of verses here to get an idea of what he's saying. Verse 11, he says, "Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb?" Things had gotten so bad that there was nothing. His life at this point, all the greatness he'd had, did not equal the suffering he was suffering now. And he says, I would have been better off if I had been a miscarriage, if I had been a stillborn. He'll use that term. And why didn't I just perish then? Why go through this? He'll also say in verse 17, there the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. You know, we talk about that survival instinct of the human being. Humans in general, we want to live. It's within us. It's this desire to fight for life. That's why you'll get the Reader's Digest and you'll read some story about a guy stuck in the ocean, or a shark attack, or a guy who falls down a well, and they fight and they fight and they fight through the pain. Well, why? Because we want to live. Job had reached a point where he didn't. When he thought of death, he thought of a very sweet place. He thought of it as the place where there's no more troubling by the wicked, nobody can bother me anymore, and the weary are at rest, life is peaceful. He said, just take me to death. Death is where I want to be. Then verse 20, he says, why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter of soul? Here he just looked, he says, why am I here? Why am I living? If I've gone through all this, I'm this miserable. Why can't I just die? Now, this is something when my grandfather was dying, and it got worse and worse, and he reached that point where it was so bad, everything, your body's falling apart, and there was no value to life for him anymore. You know, couldn't see, bedridden, everything was horrible. And he was talking with my father, and my dad said, Ben, it's okay, just let go. And Ben said, I just can't. I would if I could. I don't know how to do it. That's where Job's at. I want to die. If you told me just move 5 feet over there and you'll die, I'd do it. I'd jump. I can't do it. There's light, there's life given to me. I'm miserable. I'm just bitter and so all I want to do is die, and I just can't. That's where he's at. So this chapter gives us a little bit of a picture of where this man is. And, and a moment to kind of see what it was like to walk in his shoes, to sit there with the pain he went through and the misery. And just, all I want to do is die. If you could tell me how to do it, I'd do it. But of course, it doesn't work that way, right? Job chapter 3, verse 23, it says, "Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged in?" Now this is an interesting verse because Satan made a statement about God hedging in Job, didn't he? Remember back there in chapter 1 and chapter 2, he says, "You built a hedge around Job and nothing bad can get to him." Job uses the same phraseology, except he means it the exact opposite. He says, "Why am I living when God has built a hedge around me and I can't get to anything good? All the good stuff's out there and I'm in here." Now that's impressive to me. So here's this argument that Satan has, that God, you have built protection around Job and he will curse you as soon as you take it away. Well, God did more than just take the protection away. He flipped it on its end and he hedged him in where there's nothing good. All the good stuff's outside the hedge now. And yet here's Job, and it says, in all that he didn't sin. So just an impressive thing to look at. So, anybody have any questions on chapter 3? Yes, sir.
Did Job move on in chapter 3 from the last verse of chapter 1, which it says, "In all this Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing"? Isn't he kind of implicitly implying here that, why was I born, and why am I living, and why has he done this to me, and why can't I
Right.
move out of this hedge? I mean, isn't that implicitly charging God?
Well, you've got a good question there, and there will come a point. Now, we're running into a little bit of opinion here, so I'm just going to tell you my opinion on it, but it's not going to matter in the long run, because in the long run, Job is definitely going to say some things that are wrong, and God will tell him, "Job, you went too far. You said things that were wrong." Now, I don't think he's done it yet. I think everything he's done now is the exact same as our Lord on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's just that cry of pain. It's the same as when people lose loved ones, they say, "Why? Why me? Why does it have to be this way?" And then 5 seconds later, they'll say, "I know God's in charge. I know it's okay." But they'll say, "But why me? I know God. I know God knows what He's doing." And then they go back and forth. That's an emotional thing, not necessarily a statement of I believe God is evil and wrong and mistreated me. Now there will come a point where Job's going to overstep that line, and we'll see it. But I think right now we're still in that realm of, why do I even have to live? God's in charge, but He's hedged me in, and I can't do anything about it, and I don't understand it, and it's just deep, racking grief. Well, see, this is where you're going to get into opinion. We could spend a lot of time doing that, but what I'm telling you is the reason it's not going to matter is there will come a point where we can definitely pinpoint and say, yeah, that definitely is. So there will come a point where Job says something wrong. But in my opinion, once again, I'm going to use that word opinion, I put this at the same category as when Christ says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Was that a lack of faith on Christ's part when He said that? See, it definitely is not going to be, right? Because we know one thing about Christ, He lived in this life and never sinned. So there is a point where I can say, God, why me? Just like Christ did on the cross. Why me? And it's not unfaithful. But then there's another way I can say, God, why me? And it is unfaithful. And that's where you start moving into God, who is the heart knower, and the way you're saying it, and things like that. And that's why we've got to be... I've got to be honest with you that, yes, there's debate over that. Now, in my personal opinion, I don't think he's crossed that line yet. I think in a couple of chapters he will. But right now, I don't think he has yet. I think it's just that emotional burden that we as human beings have when we're weighted down with these huge weights of sorrow.
In our daily life, shouldn't we be trusting in God in everything we do and think and say?
Absolutely.
And this displays a lapse of that.
See, I would disagree with that. See, we both agree that, yes, we have to trust the Lord in everything, but the question is, by Job saying, why did I have to live? Is that him no longer trusting God? See, I think a child can come to their parents and say, why'd you have to put me on that bike when I was going to have my knees get all skinned up? And they can do it in a way that's rebellious, and mom and dad say, yeah, you're not riding the bike anymore. You're going to go in and get your hide tanned. Or they can say it in a way where mom and dad give them a hug and say, you got to learn. It's a process. I understand it hurts when you hurt. And I think that's where we're at right now, is you're looking at Job suffering and crying out with it, but it's not a lack of trust. Yes, Dave back there, and then Gene.
I think verse 10 answers that in chapter 2 that we covered.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's pretty clear. I mean, we can complain about the state we're in, but he did not go back and blame God.
Right. See, that's where I think we're at. I think at this point we're still there. Yep. I think you're right. He's not blaming God. He said, God, I accept the adversity with the good. But why the adversity? I'll accept it, but why? And so, Gene, do you have something?
Well, it seems to me like what we're looking for is the difference between the way Job is and the way his wife encouraged him to be.
Right. That's a good way to put it.
The step off would be curse God and die.
Mm-hmm.
Job always resigned himself over to God. He said some foolish things eventually, but he was humble.
Right. Yeah. And even in those foolish things he says, it's not going to be the cursing God kind of level. Like you said, there's that contrast there. That's a good way to put it. There's what his wife wanted him to do, and then there's what he's doing, and they're different. There's a difference in tone there. There's a difference in attitude, and attitude makes a big difference. Yes?
Grief is not a logical process.
Right.
And emotions overrule reason.
Mm-hmm.
He's going back and forth.
Exactly. And that's why you got that, God, why? I understand. I understand the Lord's in control. Why me? Why do I have to suffer? I want to die. And that back and forth is, like you said, the emotions grab the steering wheel, and all of a sudden you're over here. But logically, he's still trusting the Lord. Any other questions? Okay. So now chapter 4, chapter 5, we're going to now move into Eliphaz's first argument. And all three of these guys' argument will come down to the same thing. Job, you're suffering because you've sinned. You've done something wrong. All three guys, that's their argument. But they're going to bring it up different ways. Now, Eliphaz, before we get into his argument, look at how he starts talking. Verse 2 of chapter 4. If one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking? Surely you have instructed many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. But now it comes upon you, and you are weary. But you notice how he starts here. Remember I told him this guy's the nicest? He starts out and says, Job, I know you've helped people. I know there have been people who stumbled, and you picked them up. I know there were weak people, and you strengthened them. You've done many, many good things. But now, when it happens to you, oh boy. And so now he's going to turn it and say, Job, when it happens to you, now you don't understand, whereas you did with everybody else. He's going to say in verse 7, remember now whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off? Even as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. So notice there, what's his argument in verse 7? Have you ever seen an innocent person die for being innocent? Well, yeah. But it sounds good when you say it fast. The innocent don't suffer, the guilty suffer. Have you ever seen God cut off the upright? You read through your Bible. See, I could put it like this. I say, you read through your Bible. Have you ever seen where the good people lose? In the Bible, the good people always win. So you tell me, Job, you're losing right now. I think that tells me what kind of person you are. See, that's the way he's doing it. And he says, even as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. In the New Testament, we would say, God will not be mocked. God will not be deceived. We reap what we sow. Now, I can use that term in a proper context, and I can use it in an improper context. This is a great example of improper context. He's saying, Job, look, you're suffering because you're reaping what you sowed. You sowed iniquity. You plowed iniquity, you sowed trouble, and now you're reaping it. Look, that's the way it works, buddy. Translation, Job, you've got secret sins that caused this. Remember how he started out and he says, Job, see, you're such a good guy. I've seen you help a lot of people. But look, this is the way it works. Bad people suffer. So I don't know what you did wrong, but you did something. So he introduces this idea of, Job, you sinned. Well, show me my sin. I don't know. It's a secret sin. As a matter of fact, Job's going to use that argument a lot. He's going to say, what have I done? Point it out and I will change. And he'll say it over and over and over again. And their argument is, well, we don't know, but God does. And so do you. You need to get it fixed, buddy. And so that's the Scott Beyer translation of that verse. Verse 12, he's going to say, now a word was secretly brought to me, and my ear received a whisper of it. Now verse 12, he's going to introduce this idea. Read a little farther, you'll see what he's talking about. Verse 13, and disquieting thoughts from the visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, fear came upon me, and trembling which made all my bones shake. And a spirit passed before my face, the hair on my body stood up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was silence, and I heard a voice saying, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Well, what he's talking about there is he says, I had a vision. I had a dream. And in that dream, when I was having it, my bones shook and my hair stood on end, and this spiritual being said to me, can a mortal man be more righteous than God? Here's Job, and he's suffering. Who's right, God or Job? And so he introduces this idea of, God told me. The spirits told me. Well, this is a great example of what the Bible really says about such things. Because people do this. They say, I just know. Well, how do you know? I know because I know. I know because I just feel it in my bones. And they may go so far as to say, I had a vision. God spoke to me. I prayed and He told me. Well, what does the Bible say about such things? Deuteronomy chapter 13, it says, if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder that he tells you comes to pass, and if he says, let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us serve them, you shall not listen to words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. God says, are there false prophets and false dreamers out there? Yep. How do you know? How do you know whether there's a false prophet or false dreamer? John says, test the spirits. How do I test them? This. You compare them to what God says on the subject, what the Scriptures teach on the idea. And so here Job's friend introduces this idea of, I know, I had a dream, I had a spirit come and hair stood on end, and it was a big deal. Well, I don't care how big of a deal it is. If it's contradictory to the Scriptures, it's wrong. Galatians chapter 1 verse 8 says that even if an angel tells you something that's contradictory to Scriptures, don't listen to him. Well, that's going to be the case here. It doesn't matter how fancy he makes it sound, it's wrong. Any questions on that? Okay, so chapter 6 and chapter 7 are going to be Job's reply to Eliphaz. In verse 14 of chapter 6, he's going to say, to him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown by his friend, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. Now here's an application verse, folks, if ever you read one. Here's a man who is suffering. He is hurting more than anybody before or after him suffered in life. And Job said, you guys came to comfort me. Remember how we started that out in the end of chapter 2 there? They came to bring him comfort. And so now they start telling him, Job, you've done this and you've done that and you've done these things wrong. And his answer to him in that is, he says, look, I am afflicted, I am knocked down. Kindness should be shown by his friend even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. Now Job's not saying that he did forsake God, but he's saying, even if I did, what should you do? You know, talk about it tomorrow. Somebody comes in and you've got a coworker and they say, boy, I've had all these things go wrong in my life, and you know it's because they're not living a godly life and they're not treating their spouse right, and they know they're not raising their kids right, and so their life's a total mess. And they come to you and they're weeping their eyes out and everything's falling apart. That's the best time to tell them, well, you are a dumb idiot. That's why it's all happening to you. Isn't that the best time to do it? Right when they're down, you just kick them. And you'll have the best effect on them right then, isn't it? That's what Job's saying. Look, I'm here. I'm scraping the boils. You come here, and when you finally talk, the first things you have to say is, Job, you've got problems. I know! And so this is a word from a man who's been there to us. When you have people who are hurting in your life, and they're really in the depths of sorrow, then is not the time to tell them they're a bunch of dummies. Now, there may come a time for that when things clear up a little bit and you have a chance to talk some sense into them. But right then and there's a time to show kindness, to strengthen the weak. And so Job tells them, boy, you're a real friend. You see me here, what am I going to do? I've been sitting here for 7 days. 7 days you've seen me. What have I done? I've just sat here and scraped my boils, and the first thing you have to say to me is, you sinner, you. I've been here 7 days. You've seen what I've been doing. Nothing. Job chapter 4, verse 21. Excuse me, that's going to be Job chapter 6, verse 21. He's going to say, for now you are nothing. You see terror and are afraid. I think this is a really interesting verse because I think he hits it on the head. Let's be honest with ourselves for a second when we see people hurting. When we see people who go through horrible things, they lose loved ones, they deal with great sickness. You know, why is it we don't like going into hospitals? I mean, that's a very common thing for us as human beings. We don't like going into hospitals. Why don't you like going into a hospital? Because it makes you think about stuff you don't want to think about. That's why. Right? That's why people don't like going to funerals. It makes you think about stuff you don't want to think about. That's why the average person, if they could go to a birthday party or go to a funeral, will pick the birthday party. And what is it that God tells you ought to go to? You ought to go to the funeral because you'll consider. But we don't like considering. That's what Job says. He says, for now you are nothing. You see terror and are afraid. His friends looked at where Job had fallen from, what he had suffered, and it made them uncomfortable. Because it made them think about suffering and loss and pain and the human condition, death. And that's not something we like to think about. That's why we don't talk to people when they're hurting. That's why the average human being does not reach out to somebody else when we see them in pain, is because I'm afraid it's catching. That's why. I'm afraid it's contagious. And so we're uncomfortable around hurting people. And Job says, I can see it in your eyes, guys. I can see it in you. You're scared. And I think, once again, it's an excellent point he makes about the human condition. We are uncomfortable around such things. Job chapter 7, verse 6, he says, my days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and are spent without hope. Oh, remember that my life is a breath. My eye will never again see good. Now, here's an interesting thing. We talk about this kind of language all the time. When he says swifter than a weaver's shuttle, that's when you look at a weaver and they've got that shuttle, how fast does it go? Real quick. James will talk about it, and he says your life is but a vapor. Paul will say, my life is but a handbreadth. All those mean the same thing. Life is short. Now, when we think about that, in general, the way we think about life is short is count your days and remember it. Remember you're not going to live forever. That's not what Job's saying. Job's saying, God, please remember my life's supposed to be short. My life's supposed to be a breath. Please don't let that breath hang on too much longer. I'm ready to be done. Pain does funny things to us, doesn't it? We look at life totally different when we are suffering. And when you look at Job, every one of us, myself included, there are going to be verses in here you're going to look at and you're going to go, I don't get it. What's he talking about there? But you know why you do that? Because you've not been through what he's been through. And then there may come a day where you've suffered some that you haven't now, and you go read that same verse and you go, oh, I get it now. Because suffering changes the way you look at life. It changes your attitude and disposition. And that's exactly what God tells us, that we should rejoice in tribulation. Not because it's fun, but because it makes a change in our character and our hearts and our lives that can happen in no other fashion. That's the only way it occurs. Anybody have any questions on that? Okay. Well, we've got 3 minutes here, and I'm going to try and power through at least part of chapter 8. Chapter 8, we're going to be introduced to Bildad's first argument. Now, in chapter 8, Bildad's going to step in, and to give you a feeling for his disposition and the way he argues things, look at what he says in verse 4. If your sons have sinned against him, that is, if they sinned against God, he has cast them away for their transgression. He starts the whole thing out by saying, all your kids, and they died. Well, they died because they sinned, and God got rid of them because of it. Boy, isn't that really comforting? That's the way Bildad starts his argument. Job, I'm real sorry that you lost their kids. Too bad they're a bunch of sinners you had to wipe out like that. These guys aren't doing a great job comforting, are they? Before I move to chapter 9 and 10, let me put in a couple more thoughts in there before I go quite that fast, especially because I don't really want to cover 9 and 10 yet. Let's go back to the beginning of chapter 8 and look at how he starts. He says, how long will you speak these things and the words of your mouth be like a strong wind? Job, you're just blowing away. You're just forcing ideas that aren't biblical. They're not scriptural. You're just trying to get us to believe you're an innocent man by talking loud and harsh. He says, does God subvert judgment, or does the Almighty pervert justice? Well, look there at verse 3. This is the beauty of false doctrine. It always starts out the same way. If I stand up here and I ask you, does God pervert justice? How many of you are going to say yes? We're all going to say no. I mean, that's a dumb question. Does God pervert justice? No. But then his point is, if God doesn't pervert justice, then really what happened to your kids, what happened to you, is because you did something wrong, buddy. And so he builds into it this idea that isn't inherent in the concept of God being just. And so, as you go and you look at Bildad, that's what he's going to do is just a little bit stronger than his buddy Eliphaz, but it's the same idea of, Job, you sinned. You've done wrong. You're a bad guy. And your kids were bad people, and that's why they died. And so Job, fess up, or the same will happen to you. You're suffering because you've done wrong. And so as we look here at Job and Job's suffering and all these arguments these guys bring up, they all come down to that same central idea of they believe Job is suffering because Job has sinned. Job is a wicked man. They don't know how he's wicked, but he's got to be wicked. That's the only reason you'd suffer like that. Anybody have any questions before we close up shop? Okay, next week we'll pick up in chapter 9. We'll look at Job's response to Bildad and continue on through the book like that.